Welcome to Season 4 of Let's Talk MedTech, the premier podcast for the medical device industry. My name is Omar Ford, and I'm the host. I'm also editor-in-chief of MD+DI, an online publication owned by Informa that covers the medical device industry. On today's episode of Let's Talk MedTech, I'm speaking with Jijo James, Chief Medical Officer for Johnson & Johnson MedTech and Interventional Oncology. In this role, he drives strong safety governance and risk management across the product lifecycle, promoting safe and effective patient outcomes. Jijo is going to talk to us about J&J's patient safety efforts and how the device briefing tool has been a game changer during procedures. It's an incredible conversation, and I can't wait for you to hear it. So without further ado, let's just jump right into the conversation. Let's talk MedTech with Johnson & Johnson's Jijo James. Well, good morning and welcome to Let's Talk MedTech. Jijo, I'm excited to have this conversation with you today about J&J's efforts to maintain and improve patient safety. But before we jump into the crux of the conversation, can you tell us about why and how you got into MedTech, into the medical device industry?
Good morning, Omar, and thank you so much for having me on the podcast. Equally excited to share a little bit about myself, but more importantly, to share how J&J and most specifically, the Office of the Chief Medical Officer is championing healthcare innovation by combining clinical safety and safety science and epidemiology and bioethics experience to inform evidence and science-based product decisions that puts patients first. Talking about myself, throughout my career, I've had a number of roles as a physician, a consultant, technologist that allowed me to work across life sciences, across both pharma and the MedTech sector. So about 8 years ago, as part of my continued development, my then mentor and manager, Dr. Joanne Waldstreicher, who was Chief Medical Officer at J&J, asked me if I might be interested in making the transition to MedTech. Of course, it was a new space, and I was bound to learn and be stretched. And I was also very intrigued and excited about the fundamental differences between a therapeutic and a device. They say everything you need to know about a therapeutic could potentially be fit on two sides of its sheet of paper. But when it comes to MedTech, it's very complex. The operator in the middle plays a very important role in determining patient outcomes. And what that means for us in medical safety or patient safety is that it's not only critical to rigorously test and have the safest devices in the market, but we also need to help train and wrap these devices with services that enable appropriate and safe use while not interfering in the practice of medicine.
Very interesting. That's interesting to think about how, a therapeutic, you can fit all the information about it on both sides of the sheet of paper. But when you talk about MedTech, when you talk about devices, there's that critical component of the operator. I never thought of it in those terms before.
It's something that I wouldn't, and of course, I'm being facetious when I talk about putting things on two sides of a sheet of paper. It's a lot more complicated than that. But it's just the fact that, Omar, if you were to prescribe a therapeutic to a patient, or if I were to prescribe a therapeutic to the patient, really the fact that you prescribed it or I did does not make a difference. They will experience the same outcomes irrespective of the prescriber. But if I were to do a procedure, or you were to do a procedure using the same devices, the outcomes could vary dramatically. And that is something that we keep in mind. So it's not just the product, it's beyond the product and what we can do to ensure patient safety.
Well, let's switch gears for a bit. Can you briefly describe what is meant by device-related interruptions when discussing patient safety?
Thanks for that. So as background, surgical complications account for about 8% of deaths worldwide. And by some measures, you could even say it's the third leading cause of death. And of these, about 30% and nearly half of all post-operative complications are potentially preventable. Now, when we break these errors down, technical errors are responsible for fewer than half of the preventable deaths. Non-technical errors, such as breakdowns in communication and teamwork, are increasingly recognized as a major contributor to surgical morbidity and mortality. Surgical devices are an important source of such interruptions in the OR. And while technological advances have benefited surgical care in countless ways, the complexity of devices also represents a distinct challenge for teams in the OR. And as such, devices now account for about 15% of disruptions in surgical workflow, and believe it or not, nearly 25% of errors. As an example, surgical staplers alone were associated with about 8,000 complications per year in the US, including anastomotic leak, bleeding, surgical site infections, and this is data from the FDA.
Mhm.
So while there are instruments such as the well-recognized WHO safe surgery checklist that includes process checks to ensure that necessary equipment is available, there is still a clear need for more proactive communication to promote team communications around the surgical device to improve device safety. And it was in this way that J&J MedTech partnered with Ariadne Labs. Some of you may know Ariadne as a joint health innovation center of Brigham and the Harvard Chen School of Public Health. And we worked with them to collaborate to develop a new tool called the device briefing tool to standardize safety measures in the OR to help improve those communications in the OR.
Excellent segue into my next question. Could you go into a little more depth about the device briefing tool and talk about how it's made a reduction in device-related interruptions?
Sure. So if you think about it, every time you introduce a new device in the operating room, you're introducing risk.
Yes.
It does not matter what the device is, just the fact that there's something new in the OR is introducing risk in itself. So we're designing tools to help drive safe and effective patient outcomes. And what we're doing is trying to help improve communications in the operating room. Now, the surgeon is usually the constant in the OR. The supporting staff, the scrub nurse, the rotating nurse, they kind of keep moving around between the different ORs to be able to support the workload. So while most often the surgeons are well trained in the device, especially the new device, a lot of times this is new for that staff that's rotating between operating rooms. They're not necessarily the same people that the surgeon operates with all the time. So kind of following the same principles of the safe surgery checklist, we've devised a 4-question questionnaire that is equivalent to that timeout that the surgeon takes that asks 4 simple questions. And the beauty is not those questions, but the fact that you're pausing and encouraging a dialogue, because the questions are simple. It's, are you aware there's a new device in the OR? Have you read the instructions for use?
Hmm.
Do you have any questions? Is the device ready for use? So if you think about it, there's nothing proprietary or magical about these questions, but what it does is it allows an opportunity for the team to ask questions and be
Yes.
prepared for the use of that device. And we did a pilot of this tool with Singapore General Hospital. And as you know, Singapore General is probably among the top 5 healthcare systems in the world. And we combined it with the WHO Safe Surgery Checklist. And we were absolutely amazed by the results that we got. And these results are published in JAMA Surgery. It showed that this device briefing tool, when used in conjunction with the Safe Surgery Checklist, reduced device-related interruptions by 86.7%. So
Wow.
almost 87%
Wow.
reduction in interruptions. And if you were to kind of think about it, the decreased number of interruptions hopefully means better surgical outcomes.
Sure. It's amazing. We take this for granted, but it seems like you're with this, with the questionnaire, with the procedures, you're giving everyone in the OR a chance to take a deep breath and just review and have a conversation about what you're about to do. And and about how the device will be used, and just to make sure that there's an understanding. I I can imagine. I'm thinking about other fields, right, or other industries where you just kind of jump into it and you just start work and you get caught up in the day to day. But this gives you a moment to just. It's a practical way of taking a moment to make sure that you're ready to perform this surgery and that you understand the device's use. And if
Uh-huh.
there are any questions, yeah.
Absolutely. And actually, we are also looking to expand this into the whole manufacturing process onto the plants. Kind of the same principle, right? The idea is to pause and provide space for a conversation. And
Yes.
it's amazing how that simple step of just having a conversation can result in better outcomes.
Awesome. Who would have thought just talking, talking about something? All right. I want to dive a little bit more into what J&J is doing to enhance patient safety. And one thing that stands out to me is the fact that J&J is generating scientific evidence to inform regulatory decisions. And an example of this would be the Nest partnership. Could you talk a little bit about that for a moment?
Sure, no, happy to. So maybe I'll break it into two parts. So safety and patients are embedded in our culture at J&J. For those of you who are familiar with the credo, which is our North Star, the first line in the credo talks about patients. And in that vein, J&J has set the Office of the Chief Medical Officer. That's an independent function. We're not part of R&D, neither are we part of commercial. In fact, my group sits outside of the sector. So we sit outside of MedTech, and the Office of the Chief Medical Officer reports directly into the Chairman and CEO of J&J. What this enables us is to keep patients first and enable proactive clinical and medical safety excellence across the product lifecycle, and to take some of the learnings that we have in the post-marketing space and drive that into product development as well. So, kind of shifting gears into this space of real-world evidence and real-world data, as real-world data sources are becoming more available, RWE, or evidence, is becoming a more increasingly central resource to
Mhm.
inform our safety-related decision-making, unlocking many doors in the field of medical devices. Um, Thanks to RWE, surgeons now have more comprehensive information about how the devices are working in the real world, and that helps them make critical decisions in the operating room. On the regulatory side, real-world evidence is supplementing our understanding of safety and effectiveness of medical devices outside of randomized clinical trial testing, and helping companies and regulators detect and correct potential safety problems faster than ever. But
Yes.
what that requires us in the safety space is to produce regulatory grade real world evidence. And what do I mean by that? It means that you need to use the same kind of rigor that you're using to design a randomized control trial when you're designing these studies. Have the objectives clearly defined before you start the study. Declare your hypothesis before you start the study. Declare your statistical analytical methods before you start the study. Publish them, and
Mhm.
then go ahead and start the study. So it's kind of the same principles we do when we do an RCT, right? You follow all these steps and then you go ahead and do the study, because that just gives more gravitas and ensures that you're staying away from any potential bias as you're interpreting results. Um, Shifting gears, we're using also real world evidence in medical devices to
Mhm.
drive leadership and partnership through the Medical Device Innovation Consortium and our partnership with NEST, which is the National Evaluation System of Health Technology. And we partnered with them to figure out how best to use real world data, real world evidence to drive patient access. And through that partnership, we were able to secure the first ever FDA approved label expansion based
Yes.
exclusively on comparative effectiveness from a real world study, the data source being electronic health record databases for the Thermocool Smart Touch catheter. And at that time, it was also the first NEST test case to progress to FDA review and label extension approval.
Oh, that's a huge milestone. To actually see tangible, an FDA approved label extension. That is amazing. That's good.
It
Yeah,
it is, and it takes some time, and we're
yeah.
still taking baby steps. And there are a lot of questions and unanswered questions that we're working on around data sources, methodologies, etc. But sure enough, we're making a lot of progress.
Now I'm going to ask you a kind of silly question. It might seem just a little silly, but it's an important one nonetheless. Nonetheless, when we're talking about patient safety, how important is the patient voice in these matters, right? Can we talk about why it's extremely important to capture the patient's voice?
Not a silly
Yeah.
question at all. Probably the most important question,
Yes,
and
yes. Yeah.
I'll share with you what a friend of mine and patient advocate, Heidi Dose, said to us once in a public forum. And she said, when you as industry talk about product life cycles, you forget that we as patients have only one life cycle.
Wow. Wow.
So capturing the patient voice is extremely important throughout the life cycle of products. Um, we all know patients have increased access to information online. They track their health through wearables.
Yes.
Dr. Google has been replaced by Professor ChatGPT, and
Yes.
it does a pretty good job at providing responses. Patients are more engaged
Mhm, mhm.
in their healthcare. They want to be communicated to very directly. We continue to see overlap between drugs and devices, leading to an increase in the number of combination products and local drug delivery. And we have the opportunity to leverage the patient voice through benefit risk assessments to understand what's acceptable to them. So, all these factors will lead to patients wanting more transparency and being heard by their provider and by us as industry throughout their healthcare journey.
We always have this conversation here at Let's Talk MedTech about the patient transforming into something other than the patient. And I know that might sound weird, but they're taking more ownership, and we haven't quite coined the term. They're not necessarily consumers, but there's a different connotation now. There's a different, yeah, and I'm drawing a blank here because I don't think we have named the phrase, but I will say this. Patients are now more concerned with their health. They're reaching out to the technologies, the resources, the information that they need to really have a conversation with their surgeon, with their doctor, their
Absolutely.
physician. Yes, yeah,
And as they should, Omar, if you think
yeah.
about it, right?
Mhm.
As they should. Um, when's the last time you walked into a car dealership? And I'm going to get a lot of flack for this. But when's the last time you walked into a car dealership and asked the salesperson, hey, tell me what's the best car for me?
Hmm.
Right? You do
Yeah,
your research,
that's right.
you figure out what's important to you,
Hmm, hmm.
and you go in informed.
Yes,
If we
yes.
do it for something as simple as cars, why wouldn't we do that for our health? And they're doing exactly the same thing as they should. And I know we're struggling with the term, but it's all about shared responsibility.
Yeah.
It's shared responsibility between the patient, the provider, and those who are providing solutions to address their condition.
Amazing. Yes, yes. A good point. I never thought of it that way. Yep. Well, finally, I want to talk a little bit about 2025 and what does that hold for J&J and any projects that you can tease that you're working on. I know this is a trick question. This is a little bit tricky, but anything you can tease out that you're working on.
So happy to do that. I think there's
Yeah.
a lot of excitement at J&J with the convergence of technology and biology and the golden era that's going to unlock. And there's a lot that's happening on innovation. But I think what I'm most excited about, if I were to bring it down to my world in the Office of the Chief Medical Officer in MedTech, is around the work that we're doing in the quantification of benefit risk and using real world data to better understand patient preferences. If you think about benefit risk assessments, while we do a great job at them, we've got an amazingly detailed way of quantifying risk. If you think about it, the benefits, we don't do that great of a job outside of just pure clinical benefits. We don't capture, for example, the fact that if a patient has a successful cardiac ablation, the individual could start eating green leafy vegetables. Where does that play in our assessments? So we're working using the same methodologies to quantify benefit risk that will result in a ratio that will help better guide some of the decisions that we're making throughout the product lifecycle. It's not just post-market, but it's in decisions that we make in advancing products through the development lifecycle. And that's something that I'm extremely excited about because I think that will help us be more objective in driving patient-centered decisions.
Well, Jijo, thanks for coming on to Let's Talk MedTech. This was an amazing conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's it for this episode of Let's Talk MedTech. Thanks once again to our guest, Jijo James of Johnson & Johnson. Be sure to visit us or check us out at MDDIonline.com for all of your MedTech news. That's MDDIonline.com. Finally, make sure to rate, review, and subscribe to Let's Talk MedTech on Apple Podcast or wherever you get your podcast.